Good morning, I'm Dave Christie with your LaRouche Organization Daily Update for Thursday, January 29th. So I'm going to discuss the permanent war, permanent revolution underway now, particularly in the apparent buildup for a war with Iran, as well as what we're seeing on the streets of Minnesota, which looks to be died down, but certainly could be a template for further such actions. Now, in the phrase permanent war, permanent revolution refers to work that Executive Intelligence Review had done on the figure of Alexander Helfand, otherwise known as Parvis. Parvis was a British intelligence asset that was involved in various subversive activities on behalf of the British Empire that he was deployed by, particularly his work with Leon Trotsky on the matter of permanent revolution. They put together some of these concepts in the early 1900s and were involved in the deployment of the Bolsheviks to bring down the Russian Empire at that time. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to cover a lot of the details of Parvis's work, other than I will note that he was, in addition to working with Trotsky, he also worked with Vladimir Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was one of the ardent Zionists that was later dubbed by David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. Ben-Gurion referred to Jabotinsky as Vladimir Hitler, in apparent reference to similar tactics. There was also questions on certain alliances that were had at that time. Anyway, I will note one thing that actually is from an article that Harley Schlanger put together, so you can read that in Executive Intelligence Review. Use the search engine for all of your historical research. It's a very valuable tool. But anyway, one of Jabotinsky's, a person in his movement, an attorney that was in his party at the time, Eliyahu Cohen, said at that time, were the Hitlerites to remove their hatred of the Jews from their program, we too would stand by their side. Had the Hitlerites not risen in Germany, it would be loss. Yes. And then he added, Hitler saved Germany. So that's one of Jabotinsky's collaborators, or at least a member of his party, of his political party. Now, Parvis and Jabotinsky were collaborating on the British project of Lord Palmerston. Palmerston effectively pushed the idea of blood and soil, in other words, that people's identity and affinity to each other should lie in their ethnicity, cultural components, religions, whatever, but that there was no universality amongst humanity, which, though they may have different language, culture, etc., religions, that there was nothing that could be celebrated or seen as universal principles in that. And so Palmerston did was basically seize upon that to create divisions. And he was specifically trying to destroy the rise of the American system at that time. This is the mid to late 1800s, where you had the works of Henry C. Carey, the economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln. Carey's ideas of the American system, that of Hamilton and others who promoted the idea that not only could you have internal development through a network of unified infrastructure, transportation corridors, energy production, canals, all these matters, not only could you have that for the development of your own nation, but that you could collaborate with other nations in continental and really global projects. That was the idea of Henry Carey, and that was taking off in the 1800s, and Palmerston sought to destroy that through this blood and soil concept, that we would all just go back to our, self-absorbed identities and not have any sort of unified conception across cultures and across the landscape. And so what Palmerston did, it was often referred to as Palmerston Zoo. You had Mazzini, one of the operatives of the British in Italy, created the Young Italy movement. You had the Young Turks. You had all these different, including the Confederacy was a part of this ideology. But this was all promoted by the British as part of Palmerston's Zoo. And on the Young Turks, Jabotinsky and Parvis, part of their collaboration was on one of the publications of the Young Turks, which went a long way into sowing the kind of discord that ultimately led to World War I. It's of note that Jabotinsky's personal secretary, or the secretary, was Benzion Netanyahu. That's the father of Benjamin Netanyahu. So you can see how these things play out. Now, what EIR was covering on the work of Parvis at the time is that it's pretty well known now that many of the neoconservatives that populated the Bush administration later, they had come out of the Trotskyist, political movements of the 60s and so on. And that what EIR was making clear, that it was this permanent war, permanent revolution doctrine of both Parvis and Trotsky that they were aligned with. And so, they were the ones that cooked up the regime change menu of the targeted nations like Iraq, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Somalia. The list went on, but of course the icing on their satanic cake was always Iran. So now I would just only add, and that of course, ultimately the point of all of these regime change operations was not any sort of specific stability that they sought, but rather this kind of permanent chaos in which the cartel apparatus of the City of London could rule over the top and just run it through the warlords and the drug gangs and the criminal apparatus below them, versus a sovereign nation system of sovereign nations that could potentially defy their power. That's what this has all been about. Now, I'll only add one other name to this mix, given the reference to the neoconservatives, was that even before they had consolidated as a movement, you had Bernard Lewis, a British intelligence operative out of Princeton, who essentially wrote nearly the identical regime change program of the Wolfowitz Doctrine or the Project for New American Century. Bernard Lewis had put that together, what was referred to as the Bernard Lewis Plan. It should be noted that his son, Michael Lewis, was for 40 years the head of AIPAC, the American Israeli Political, whatever it is, AIPAC. Michael Lewis, Bernard Lewis's son, headed the opposition research of AIPAC for nearly 40 years, only resigning or retiring about a year ago. So I'm sure that those members of Congress or business leaders that dared oppose the Bernard Lewis Plan or its later incarnations as the Wolfowitz Doctrine or the Project for New American Century, they were probably on that opposition research of Michael Lewis. All right, now just to come back to the situation in Iran as part of this long-term project. CNN, I'll just quote what they say, they report that Trump is, quote, weighing a major new strike on Iran after preliminary discussions between Washington and Tehran over limiting the country's nuclear program and ballistic missile production failed to make progress, according to people familiar with the matter. The New York Slimes has a similar report. This follows on what Marco Rubio said yesterday in his Senate testimony. Rubio, of course, is kind of our modern day Henry Kissinger, having the dual hat of both national security advisor as well as Secretary of State. That's what Kissinger was in his time. Rubio, so far as we know, has not stated what Kissinger did, which is that Kissinger famously said that he kept the British Foreign Office more informed than his own State Department. But Rubio doesn't have to say that because he's just doing their bidding. But anyway, regarding Iran, what Rubio said yesterday to the Senate was, he says that regime is probably weaker than it has ever been. And the core problem they face, unlike the protests you saw in the past on some other topics, is that they don't have a way to address the core complaints of the protests, which is that their economy is in collapse. He doesn't mention the economic warfare and sanctions policy that has driven it into the kind of crisis that we saw that was the beginning of the protest scene, the really nonviolent protests that we saw, which was then infiltrated by the ISIS adherents on behalf of CIA, MI6, Mossad, etc., that then came in and started killing people, resulting in the crackdown from the government of Iran at the time. Anyway, Rubio says, well, the president does reserve the option in self-defense to eliminate that threat. We don't want to see that. We don't anticipate it, but it could happen. We hope not. We hope it won't happen. Anyway, what Rubio's saying is that in order to prevent that, we have to result in self-defense to eliminate that threat. That's just obvious changing of the narrative, which clearly Trump has dropped the protest scene as the means for military action, is now reverted to just the other issue of nuclear weapons production, supposedly that Iran is pursuing that, even though, of course, our own intelligence agencies have for decades said that they are not doing that, including Tulsi Gabbard's report from last year, I believe it was, saying that they're not pursuing it. Now, I will just add, well, it's clear that Trump, we don't know what he'll do. If he even is in control of what he does anymore. We know that Netanyahu and the Neocons are nipping at his heels for action on Iran, but we also undoubtedly have those of the MAGA stripe reminding him that his presidency would be finished on Iran. They should actually remind him of the British ambassador in Trump's first term, who had famously said that we need to flood the zone and get, people around Trump to attack Iran, because that will indeed destroy his presidency. That would have been part of the regime change apparatus. Now, so we don't know what Trump will do. I should also add that those that are pushing him against any attack should, not only that will destroy his presidency, this could unleash chaos in the world. Iran has said that that they're going to respond forcefully to this. And given what happened in the last 12-day war, so-called, where Iran had barely even scratched the surface of what they have in their reserves in terms of missiles, including hypersonic missiles, they may unleash the kind of response that Israel's only potential defense would be nuclear weapons, and that would, if those are dropped, then the situation becomes uncalculable. All right, now Erdogan has stepped in, reportedly offering Trump his role as a mediator. The Saudis and the UAE, I believe, both have said that their bases can't be used for such an attack. So there's obviously some kickback against this. Now, on the permanent revolution situation inside of Minnesota, we obviously have the Trump administration feeling under heat for what's happened with the two murders of the protesters. We had Greg Bovino, the commander-at-large of the Border Patrol, was removed from the scene in Minnesota. Obama's former border czar, Tom Homan, seems to be on the scene more prominently. There's supposedly discussions going on with the Waltz governorship and Jacob Fry, the mayor of Minneapolis. But this is obviously in response to outrage within Trump's own base, and as well as those Republican who Republicans who have long had it out for Trump, given their response to the murder of Alex Preddy in particular, saying, where the Trump people in the Trump administration were saying that he was a domestic terrorist, he had a gun. On the latter point of him having a gun, the NRA is apparently quite miffed, given that Preddy was in his rights not only within Minneapolis law, which had given him a concealed carry permit, but as well that, this is a violation of the Second Amendment, which of course NRA is vociferously in support of. I should mention his own First Amendment rights were also violated in the sense, or claims that he was there as a, protester and so on. This is within his rights to be protesting ICE violations and so on. Now, on the other side, people are saying, well, they're pointing to the BBC release of a video that apparently shows Preddy, or assumed to be Preddy, shouting at ICE officers and even kicking out the headlights or the rear lights of their vehicle, saying, well, look at him. He's not a nonviolent protester. Look at what he's doing. And then this crowd will also say, well, look at the Soros money flowing into the protest groups, or these really extremely well organized protest coordination groups on the Signal app, which almost are at a military style level. But they will point to that, the violence of Preddy and the organized money coming in from Soros and the kind of paramilitary style deployment of this group to then justify what is an extreme violation by ICE in the sense of the Fourth Amendment of just pulling people over and not, we want to see your papers. This is the exact kind of things that were addressed by the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, as well as violations of the First Amendment, that as long as they are nonviolent, they can be out there whether they're getting Soros money or not. Same thing goes for the Second Amendment. If somebody shows up to a protest scene, that's within their rights. So on this matter, I will just remind people what Benjamin Franklin once said: those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And that's the point on this, is those who say, well, look at what's going on in the streets of Minneapolis. Maybe we need ICE to bring the hammer down. I remind you that ICE was a creation of the Department of Homeland Security following the attempts within the Bush administration to set up the post 9/11 police state apparatus. So, but in all of this, cui bono, who benefits? I think it should be clear, Soros is on the one hand supporting the migrant caravans that were bringing in cheap labor and benefiting from the cartel apparatus that profits in human trafficking and drug trafficking and so on. And Soros is also benefiting from the kind of turbulence that we see, to then get people to say, well, we need to bring in a police state to defend ourselves. So Soros is nothing but a British asset, and it is indeed the British Empire that benefits from this kind of, it is their promotion over centuries of this permanent war, permanent revolution dogma that we've seen in all of these forever wars and the supposed conflict amongst the American people, ultimately who all want the same thing. And it's this kind of chaos being sown to think that they don't actually have common interest, and that can be based on principle. And so the solution to this is, we don't need to be throwing, well, I would say if we want to throw the tea of the British East India Company over into the Boston Harbor, maybe that should be sanctioned or seen as a useful protest. But what we have now is the approach of Dr. Martin Luther King, the peaceful, nonviolent approach that he outlined. And indeed, that is what Helge Sepp LaRouche is organizing, of a global citizens movement to come together on the approach of King, on the approach of Gandhi, to say not only to outline ultimately what are the principles, what is the basis of natural law, or of international law. International law has been subverted and diminished in terms of its effect by the rules-based international order, which has engaged in this subversive activity to overthrow governments and engage in forever wars and so on. But actual international law should be based on natural law, as is the U.S. Constitution. And so what Helge Sepp LaRouche has done is pulled together a global citizens movement to debate and deliberate on what that should be and how that should be played out now. So that's what's going to be discussed on tomorrow's International Peace Coalition. You should sign up and participate in that meeting tomorrow. You can find that on the schillerinstitute.com site. And otherwise, Harley, I'm sure, will be answering questions. So send those into harleysch@gmail.com. And otherwise, stay tuned to the LaRouche organization.